All right, welcome back in. We are still on section 6.4, bone formation, development, and growth. And what we're going to be doing now is talking about endochondral ossification. So here it is, endochondral ossification. My last video, we discussed the process of intramembranous ossification. Now, most of the long bones of the body, in fact, most of the bones of the body, are formed through endochondral ossification, and that's the process we're going to talk about right now. Endochondral ossification begins with a hyaline cartilage model. And so, this whole thing begins as mesenchymal cells aggregate in a place where a bone is eventually going to be formed. They differentiate into chondroblasts. And these chondroblasts begin secreting this hyaline matrix. It's a highly collagenous, collagen kind of matrix. The hyaline matrix, a very clear, glassy looking kind of matrix. And as they secrete this matrix around, these chondroblasts secrete the matrix around themselves, they trap themselves again within these lacunae inside of the matrix. And at that point, they're now referred to as chondrocytes. So in this first image here, A, that's what you have. This is a model of a bone made out entirely of hyaline cartilage. It was laid down by chondroblasts, which formed this collagenous matrix, hyaline matrix, and entrapped within it these chondroblasts, which are now called chondrocytes, in these lacuna. Now, that process will continue as these chondroblasts continue to divide mitotically. Each time they begin establishing more matrix around them, the model grows. And so as we go around to B here, what you can see is the growing hyaline cartilage model of the bone. Now, something interesting is happening as this model, hyaline cartilage model, grows. It is beginning to be problematic for the chondroblasts and chondrocytes in the center of this model to get their nutrients. Here's the reason. Typically, uh, hyaline cartilage and all cartilage is not penetrated by blood vessels. And you can see here there are no blood vessels penetrating this, and because of that, the cells near the middle are only receiving their nutrients and their exchange of oxygen and other waste products by way of diffusion into and out of the hyaline cartilage model. And because of that, things are getting rather rough on the middle of these cells, and many of them begin to what we call hypertrophy or hyperatrophy, and they actually just begin dying. And in the process, they're reabsorbing some of the matrix that they laid down, and they're creating kind of this spongy nature inside of here. And as they begin to die, it actually creates a chemical process which begins to calcify this cartilaginous matrix. So the hyaline cartilage matrix begins to calcify. It's not bone, but it kind of resembles bone. It becomes very brittle, and it absolutely prevents further diffusion into and out of this area, further contributing to the death of these chondrocytes. Now, that sounds really bad, but as it turns out, that is the beginning of the formation of the bony material inside of this hyaline cartilage model. Okay, so this calcified cartilage matrix here in the middle is the beginning. Now, I want to show you that simultaneously, there's also beginning to develop what we call a bony collar. So this hyaline cartilage model was surrounded by a perichondrium. That's just a fibrous membrane called the perichondrium that surrounds it. It also consists of those chondrogenic cells that produce the chondroblasts and eventually, the chondrocytes. So that's what it looks like when it's developing early on. These chondrogenic cells are replaced by osteogenic cells, and the osteogenic cells are producing osteoblasts, which the osteoblasts then form their osteoid. They secrete this osteoid out, which becomes calcified, and you actually have real calcified bone forming on the diaphysis of this model. It's called a bony collar. And once that forms, it is really problematic getting things into and out of the center of this Highland cartilage model by way of diffusion. It's essentially impossible. So further, death of the chondrocytes occurs in here, and further ossification or calcification, I should say calcification of that matrix occurs. If we go over to the next picture here and see, what you're beginning to see is something called the periosteal bud. This is called the periosteal bud. It's when an artery penetrates through the bony collar and brings arteries and vessels, blood vessels, into this calcified matrix. And when it does so, it brings with it some of the osteoblasts that are found here in the periosteum and the bony collar. And as those osteoblasts begin to penetrate this open calcified matrix, they begin to form new bone. So just like on the outside collar, they're now depositing and secreting osteoid, which further calcifies into bony crystals, and the beginnings of bone occur here in the middle of the shaft of this bone. Now, this is very much like what you've seen in the previous video. This is going to be a spongy kind of bone with a trabecular kind of nature, but that's how it begins. Now, this beginning here in the diaphysis of the bone, in the shaft of this bone, is called the primary ossification center. Once the nutrient artery here, called the periosteal bud, penetrates through the bony collar and feeds the inside of this Highland cartilage model, bringing osteoblasts in here to form new bone. It's called the primary ossification center. And what it does is it contributes to a bony formation in the diaphysis of the bone. Now, if we move down to the next picture, I want to show you that the further continuance of this process essentially hollows out the diaphysis, where the primary ossification center is going to be hollowed out by osteoclasts. And if you remember, osteoclasts originate from monocytes or macrophages, which are kinds of white blood cells that differentiate into these osteoclasts. And what they do is they essentially remove all of the trabecular not soft, but trabecular spongy bone, leaving what is known as the medullary cavity. You can see here it's filled with blood vessels. And it will eventually also be filled with yellow bone marrow. Now, one further thing to add here is that within this medullary cavity, those osteoclasts are often reforming and remodeling the inside of this compact bone, which was originated as the bony collar. It's got osteoblasts all along it now because the perichondrium that used to surround here was replaced with periosteum. And if you remember, the inner layer of the periosteum consists of osteogenic cells and osteoblasts. And so what the osteoblasts are doing is continually laying down more and more and more bone, and this continues to thicken. And so what is happening is actually the bone is widening in diameter, both in this direction and also in this direction. Now, the thickness of this compact bone doesn't change very much because on the inside, the osteoclasts are taking away from the bone, and on the outside, the osteoblasts are adding to the bone. So basically what's happening is the bone is just growing in diameter. This is called appositional growth. The growth in diameter is appositional growth, APP. Osithonal, appositional growth. And so that's one form of bone growth that I wanted to talk about. Bones also, will lengthen, and that is going to be taken care of by a different process. And I want to briefly introduce the rest of that process to you and then point you to another video as well. So as we move here from the illustration listed as D, I want you to notice before we do that, up in the epiphysis of the bone, that's the end of the bone, that you still have uncalcified matrix. This is still hyaline cartilage up here. But after the diaphysis continues its process of the primary ossification center, eventually making this medullary cavity and beginning the appositional growth, a secondary calcification or ossification center develops. And so if you notice down here in illustration E, that's what's going on. So the exact same process that initiated the primary ossification center takes place here as well in the epiphysis of the bone. Basically, chondrocytes near the middle of this growing hyaline cartilage model are receiving less and less nutrients because they're concentrated on the inside, and because of that, they begin to hypertrophy and also die. And as they're dying, they're calcifying the cartilage matrix around them. And so this is a secondary ossification center where the very first thing is you begin to calcify the core of this hyaline cartilage matrix. And as you do that, that continues out. Notice it also gets a service of arteries. The same way this nutrient artery entered in here, the periosteal bud, you'll also get a periosteal bud here into the secondary ossification center, and it does exactly the same thing. It carries in with it osteoblasts that begin to lay down new, true bone in here in this ossified cartilage matrix. And so a new bone center begins. And that continues on until this ossification center widens out to the point where only the outer portion is filled, it remains with hyaline cartilage. So on the outside here, on the tip of the bone is the articular cartilage, and as you see, that then comes right in and produces this plate of hyaline cartilage here called the epiphyseal plate. Now, we've talked about this before. This is known as the growth plate of the bone. And so this plate here, and I'm going to show you a video in just a moment, I'm going to direct you to a video in just a moment, will show you how this hyaline cartilage here, called the epiphyseal plate, then contributes to lengthening the bone, both in this direction and just basically continues to lengthen this bone. So appositional growth, of course, is this the growth of diameter. This epiphyseal plate contributes to lengthening of the bone, and I'm going to point you to a video in just a moment. If you look beneath this video, you will find a link to a YouTube video that I think does a tremendous job of explaining what the layers of this particular epiphyseal plate do. If I come down here, you can see the layers. Now, this is what the video is going to show you. You're going to have this cartilaginous reserve area. These are just chondrocytes and hyaline cartilage that's linked tightly to the ossified material above. So if you look in the epiphysis, the secondary ossification center is made now entirely of bone. That reserve tissue is tightly attached to that spongy bone in the epiphysis. But now this zone is pretty much stable and doesn't have any additional cell division in it. But just beneath that, you have the proliferative zone. In this zone in the hyaline cartilage, you have all these chondrocytes within the lacuna that are rapidly dividing mitotically. And as they do, they are pushing the reserve zone up and thereby lengthening the bone. And also some of these cells are beginning to contribute to the layer beneath, which is called the maturation and hypertrophy zone. So here, these cells, as you see, are growing larger. The lacunae are getting larger as they resorb some of the matrix around them. And eventually, this continues to the point where they begin to hypertrophy. This means they're rapidly growing and moving towards death. And as they transition into the layer below called the calcified matrix, what's happening is just like in the ossification centers that we talked about earlier, those chondrocytes are dying, and as they do, it's contributing to a calcification of the cartilage matrix, of the hyaline cartilage matrix. Now, once calcified, osteoclasts from the primary ossification center can make their way up in here, remove some of this ossified cartilage matrix, and osteoblasts can invade and begin forming new bone. So that just basically lengthens this metaphysis in this direction as well. So the whole process is just adding to the length of the bone, both in the terms of these osteoblasts invading the calcified area and building new bone, and it just continues to grow in this direction. So again, do take a look at that YouTube video because I think it does a great job of explaining it. And so that is endochondral growth. And again, take a look at that YouTube video for the epiphyseal plate and its role in longitudinal bone growth.